you ever get that feeling where you're just trapped in a loop of your own thoughts, a worry that just digs its claws in and will not let go? Yeah, we tend to treat that as, a personal failing, a glitch in our brain. But what if that's not it at all? What if our anxiety today is actually a pretty logical response to the world we've built? Okay, so let's get into it. Let's explore the history of why we just can't seem to stop thinking.
So, I want you to meet Daniel. His story kicks off with a fear that's probably familiar to a lot of us, especially if you've been through school: plagiarism. He got a little help on his dissertation, and this tiny seed of doubt got planted in his mind. But it didn't stay tiny. Oh no, it grew and it grew until it became this full-blown obsession, a constant looping trial playing out 24/7, entirely inside his head. And he was the one in the defendant's chair. And this really shows you how that mental trial just takes off. It starts with one single intrusive thought, in his case from a weird Google search, and it just metastasizes. It's not just one little what if, it's a whole horrifying cascade of them. Look at how the questions just build on each other, spiraling from a simple digital mistake all the way to a prison sentence. And then, finally, to this terrifying attack on his very identity. Every single layer just piles on more anxiety, until the thought itself is the real source of torment. Now, Daniel's experience, as intense as it is definitely not unique. It's actually a perfect example of this universal trap our minds can fall into. And that brings us to the famous white bear problem, which really gets to the heart of the rule that makes these thought spirals possible in the first place. Okay, so this is the absolute key, the central paradox. The harder you try to push a thought away, the stronger it comes roaring back. So when Daniel tried with all his might not to think about his fears, what do you think happened? Yep, they came back louder, stronger, and even more convincing than before. It's the core of obsessive worry. Trying to suppress the thought is literally like pouring gasoline on a fire. And believe it or not, this is not some new psychological discovery. We're talking over a century ago. The famous novelist Leo Tolstoy wrote about a game his brother came up with when they were kids. The challenge? It sounds so simple. Just stand in a corner and do not think about a white bear. Simple, right? Well, as the Tolstoy brothers found out pretty quick, it's basically impossible. And what's really cool is that modern science basically proved this little childhood game was spot on. They ran experiments. One group was told to go ahead and think about a white bear, and guess what? They had no problem stopping later on. But the other group, the one told don't think about a white bear, they were completely flooded with thoughts of it. The very act of trying to suppress the thought made it totally overwhelming. You know, even philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre waded into these waters. He took it a step further, arguing that this kind of mental anguish, it's not some bug in our programming, it's a feature. He believed it's just an inescaped freedom and the infinite, sometimes terrifying possibilities of what could be. All right, so we've got this built-in psychological engine that makes worry super sticky, the white bear problem. But what gave that engine so much fuel to burn? Well, the answer, weirdly enough, is in how we, as a species, learn to think about tomorrow. I mean, think about it. For most of human history, our minds were pretty much locked into the present moment. If you were a hunter-gatherer, what was the point of planning more than a few days out? It was useless. Your thinking was concrete, tied to what you could physically see and touch. But our modern minds, wow, we live in the future, a place that isn't even real yet. We're constantly running calculations about risks and opportunities that are 50 years down the road. This quote is it's fascinating. It comes from a Soviet study back in the 30s. A researcher gives a peasant a really simple logic puzzle about bears in Siberia. But the man just refuses to play along with the abstract rules. He says, I've never traveled through Siberia. His whole world, his whole way of thinking is based on direct, personal experience. He isn't wired to think about these hypothetical what-if worlds, the exact place our brains live all day long. So that mental skill the peasant was reluctant to use, we have a name for it: counterfactual thinking. It's basically our brain's superpower. It lets us imagine all these different realities, to ask that crucial question, what if? Now that's the engine of all creativity and innovation, but it's also the exact same engine that powered Daniel's terrifying what-if spiral. It's what lets us get completely lost in horrifying futures that don't even exist. And you can see how this obsession with the future just picked up speed. First, we went from living by the natural cycles, the seasons, to suddenly needing to plan for the next harvest. Then, bam,
The Industrial Revolution hits, and the mechanical clock starts chopping our time into these abstract, manageable little bits. And now? Well, now we live in a 24/7 digital world with a constant stream of future possibilities and risks to deal with. Each step just pulled us further away from the present and shoved us deeper into a future we feel we have to control and worry about.
So, this huge shift didn't just change how we look at the world out there, it completely changed how we see ourselves. It created this idea of, well, a machine called me.
And just to be clear, we're not talking about a fringe issue here. This is massive. Today, it's estimated that 2 to 3% of the Western population meets the criteria for an OCD diagnosis. I mean, do the math. That's millions and millions of people trapped in these kinds of thought loops, not to mention all the people who experience intense worry that doesn't quite hit a clinical level.
The sociologist Max Weber had a perfect term for this whole cultural shift. He called it disenchantment. And what he meant was we stopped seeing the world as this magical, mysterious place full of unpredictable forces. Instead, we started seeing it as a giant machine, a system that if you just had enough data, could be completely understood, predicted, and controlled. Everything becomes calculable. And that disenchanted way of seeing the world, it definitely trickles down into how we experience our own lives. I mean, this quote from a receptionist is just, it's brutal, but it's honest. When you see the world as a big machine, it's easy to start feeling like you're just another little cog in it, that your life doesn't have much meaning beyond whatever function you're supposed to perform.
Okay, so this is where it all comes together. When you see the world as a machine that needs to be controlled, you start treating yourself like a machine too. Your health, your career, your relationships, they stop being things you just live, and they become projects that you have to manage. They become these territories of risk that require constant monitoring. And what does all that monitoring create? You guessed it, a whole new universe of things to be anxious about.
All right, so we've seen the psychological trap, the white bear, and we've seen the historical forces that basically supercharged it. But what does all of this actually mean for us today, when we're stuck in a worry spiral? Well, let's try to reframe the whole problem.
And that brings us to a really challenging question. Our first instinct is to label this kind of intense worry as a disorder, right? A mental illness. But what if that label, that diagnosis, is actually pointing in the wrong direction?
This was the really provocative idea from a psychiatrist named Thomas Szasz. He argued that what we call mental illness just isn't a disease in the same way something like cancer is. It's not a broken part inside of you. For him, it was a problem in living. It was about the struggle to cope with all the complex, difficult, and sometimes painful situations that life just throws at you.
And this right here is really the big takeaway. What if your anxiety isn't a sign that your brain is broken or malfunctioning? What if it's actually a perfectly reasonable, maybe even a logical reaction to the pressures of a pretty unreasonable world? A world that is constantly demanding that you plan for the future, monitor yourself, and manage every possible risk.
And if you accept that, even just for a second, then the target for what needs fixing has to change, doesn't it? We need to stop focusing only on the individual and start diagnosing the situation. We need to look at the crazy pressures of the modern job market, the demands of family life, and a culture that constantly whispers in our ear that we are a project that could fail at any second. The anxiety isn't coming from nowhere. It's born from that context. So that leaves us with one last big idea to think about. You know, the whole self-help world is basically about fixing you so you can fit better into society. But what if we flip that? Maybe trying to achieve perfect individual happiness in the world as it's built right now is, well, maybe it's a nearly impossible task. But the idea that this society is set in stone, that it can't possibly change, that seems way more ridiculous. So what if the real project isn't about fixing our individual brains, but about starting to fix the world that makes us all worry so much in the first place?